Hey everyone, it's Daniel. I hope you're all having a very happy, and especially this year, healthy holiday season. Before we start, I just wanted to share the news that this channel just hit 100 subscribers. As always, I thank you for your continued support. As we move into 2021, I'll continue to put out the best content that I can to help you with your SAT and ACT prep. Which brings me to the topic of this video. The holidays also coincide with getting your PSAT scores back. So you might be in the position now of looking at your scores and thinking, whoa, I better get my game face on for the SAT. But what should I do? Or should I switch over to the ACT? How do I make a plan? So far on the channel, I've covered some of the most popular topics that appear on the SAT and the ACT, from the math to the reading to the grammar. But let's take a step back for a second and look at the big picture. What do you need to do to prep for the SAT and ACT? Can you really study for each? So in this video, I wanted to lay out a very specific step-by-step process that you can follow. This is the same trajectory that I use with my students. This might be a little longer than my typical videos, but I wanted to be as specific as possible to help you make a plan, particularly with steps 5 through 7, which is when the real magic starts to happen. This is how my students see their most significant score jumps on the SAT and the ACT. I hope you do as well. If you find these steps helpful, please hit that like button. Also, subscribe and share the video with other friends who are just starting their prep. And again, I do thank you for your support. Okay, let's talk about the best way to prepare for the SAT and the ACT. The first thing you want to do is get a baseline score for each test. This means taking a full version of each one timed and in one sitting. Now, for many students, the PSAT can check this off the list. Depending where you go to high school, you might take this during the fall of sophomore year, junior year, or both. Now, keep in mind that the PSAT is graded on a scale of 1520 and not 1600. But still, I find that it's a pretty good barometer for how you'll do on the real SAT. They don't hold back on the harder topics. So if you've already taken the PSAT, I don't think it's necessary to take another baseline SAT on top of that. But if you're feeling ambitious, go ahead. But you definitely want to take a full ACT. Check out the link in the description below. I'll include the books where you could find the most authentic practice tests. When you sit for your baseline ACT, make sure to do it timed and in one sitting under real testing conditions. This is especially important for the ACT, where timing is the main factor. If you run out of time, you want to know by what margin. Now, some high schools administer the pre-ACT. However, I don't find this to be an accurate barometer. The pre-ACT is, frankly, a little too easy. This goes for both the questions and the timing. So instead, you should take a full ACT. The practice book will outline how you can proctor yourself in terms of the timing and the breaks. And once you're squared away with a baseline for each, you can then think about which test you want to focus on. The SAT and the ACT each have their own pros and cons. Check out video 2 here, where I talk about how to decide between the two tests. But here's a quick recap. Most of my students find that the SAT is harder. The questions are more in-depth, and you just have to think more. But the good news is that the math doesn't pull from as advanced topics of pre-calculus or trigonometry. Also, the timing is a little kinder on that test. On the ACT, it's the opposite. Many students find that the questions are easier. They're more black and white or more straightforward. However, it pulls from more advanced topics of math, and the timing on the ACT is much more challenging. In fact, timing is often the main factor that steers many of my students away from the ACT. Some of them struggle to finish upwards of 30 or even 40% of certain ACT sections. This makes the decision very easy to focus just on the SAT. However, others don't struggle with the timing, and they do find that the ACT questions are easier. So, see how things go with your baseline ACT and consider whether or not the timing is an issue. Another thing to think about is how your scores compare between the two exams. You can do an online search for something called the concordance chart. This is a chart that compares SAT scores to ACT scores. For example, a 23 on the ACT is comparable roughly to about an 1140 on the SAT, and so on. Depending where your numbers fall, you can see if you have the edge on one test versus the other. And if they're comparable between the two, you might consider both exams. And certainly, just think about how you feel after you take each baseline test. Some students respond very favorably to the ACT. Others immediately know that they hate the science section or that they hate the timing. Trust your instinct with how you feel on the format of each. Now, some students do take both, but not everyone should. If you decide to take both, just try to space them out by at least a month. That way, you can focus on just that format for the weeks leading into the exam. Again, check out video 2, where I get into much more detail about how to decide which test you want to consider. Once you decide which test you're aiming for, you can then map out your timeline. In video 1, I get into much more detail about how to navigate the test season. Check it out. But here's a quick recap. Each test is offered 7 times a year. Now, within those months, there are certain months that you really want to think about. The reason why, only certain months throughout the year offer you the chance to analyze the actual questions from the test. For the SAT, this is called the QAS report, stands for Question and Answer Services. It's offered for October, March, and May. For the ACT, it's called the TIR report, it stands for Test Information Release. This is offered for December, April, and June. Unfortunately, the other months don't release the actual test questions. You'll get to see your scores, but not the questions. So, think about how you can use the timing of the test season to your advantage in case you end up needing to take the test a second time. Again, check out video 1, where I map this out in much more detail. If you need to take the test again, being able to analyze exactly what you missed, question by question, is invaluable. And once you have an idea of your timeline, you can start to study the material and work into timed practice sections. So as you start your prep, you'll start taking independent practice sections. In the link below, I'll include where you could buy the most authentic practice books. You can start slow, maybe do a timed reading section one day or a timed math section another day, etc. This way, you could just get used to the format of each test and how to pace yourself accordingly. Check out video 9, where I talk about the best ways to manage your time and how to navigate through the sections. Now, as you start to take these practice sections, you'll likely come across some material that you've never seen before. This might include grammar topics that are not taught in high school, or random topics of math. This is especially true for the ACT, where they throw in topics test to test that never appeared on the test before. So, take notes on any new rules or formulas that you come across. This might include jotting down the equation of an ellipse or a certain rule of punctuation that you've never learned before. Stay diligent and study those topics. I suggest making flashcards to help. But test prep is about more than just rote memorization. It's about recognizing how those topics appear again and again. And that brings us to the most important aspect of test prep, brand recognition of the question. Let's see what I mean. After years of working with students, I've learned one crucial thing. The best test takers are by no means the smartest students. They are those who can identify the underlying principle of a question. The SAT and the ACT constantly repeat the same brands of questions. The questions themselves might change from test to test, but the underlying concept is always the same. Let's see what I mean. Here's a grammar rule that's very popular on both tests. Think about what's wrong with this sentence. Brought over from Polynesia hundreds of years ago, Australia now incorporates the bird as a mascot. There's a mistake here. Let's look at that intro. Brought over from Polynesia hundreds of years ago. What word in this sentence was brought over from Polynesia? The bird. According to the rules of grammar, when you have an introduction, it must be followed by whatever word it's describing. So in other words, this needs to say, brought over from Polynesia hundreds of years ago, the bird is now the mascot of Australia. The way that it's written, it sounds like Australia was brought over. So, now that we talked about that, let's see how that could be tested with different specifics. Open to the public in 1886, tourists make the Statue of Liberty one of the most visited landmarks in New York City. I'll give you a minute on this one. Press pause, give it a shot. So just like the last question, we have to think about what that intro is describing. Open to the public in 1886. What was open to the public in 1886? The Statue of Liberty. But the way it's written, it sounds like tourists were open to the public in 1886. So a possible fix might go something like this. Open to the public in 1886, the Statue of Liberty is now one of the most visited landmarks, blah, blah, blah. There's many ways to do it, as long as the Statue of Liberty comes right after the intro. Now, you probably found that second question a little easier than the first. Why? Because you learned to spot the underlying mechanism of the question. The fancy name for this is called a misplaced modifier, but who cares? As long as you could recognize, oh, they're doing that thing where the intro has to be followed by a subject. And this is what I mean by brand recognition. My best students can look at that Statue of Liberty question and say, oh, they're doing the Australia bird thing. It's all about training your brain to recognize the underlying concept of a question. And I refer to questions like these as cousin questions. Even though the specifics might change, the concept is identical. Let's see how this works on a math question. Melissa's balloon floats at a certain distance off the ground. However, it loses enough helium so that it falls by a constant amount each day. If the following equation can be used to model its height h in feet, h equals negative 0.75x plus 15, what does the 0.75 represent, and what does the 15 represent? Now, you might recognize that this is the equation of a line. The equation of a line is y equals mx plus b, where m is the slope and b is the y-intercept. So that's what they're doing here. They're using the equation of a line to represent a real-world situation. So let's think about that. If that 0.75 is the slope, that tells you by what rate the balloon is falling. In other words, it's the change. Each unit of time, it's dropping by 0.75. And the 15 is the y-intercept. That's where you start on the y-axis. So if we were to graph this, that would represent the starting height. And this is a very popular brand of question on the test. They love to take the equation of a line and use it to describe a real-world situation. When they do, the slope is the rate of the change, and the y-intercept is the point where you start. So let's now look at a cousin question. See if you can spot it on this one. Elliot opens a savings account. He keeps it open for Q months. If the total amount D could be modeled by this equation, D equals 40Q plus 300, what does the 40 represent, and what does the 300 represent? I'll give you a minute. Press pause, give it a shot. So once again, they're giving us y equals mx plus b. The m, or the slope, is the 40. That's the rate of change. In other words, every month, it means he's adding in plus 40, plus 40, plus 40. And the 300 is the y-intercept. It's the point where you start, or in this case, the initial amount of money he puts in the bank. You are no smarter than you were 4 minutes ago, nor is the test any easier. What changed? You learned to recognize the brand of question being tested. And so it is with every question on the test. You will never see any of these questions ever again. However, you will see that brand of question again on every single test. For example, the test loves to use the equation of a line to represent a real-world scenario. I have my students call this Melissa's balloon. They also love to test misplaced modifiers. We always call this Australia's bird. And this is what I do with my students for every type of question. We come up with a stupid little name or a mnemonic device to remember it. I don't just do this to be silly. I do it so that they can start to recognize how all of these questions are identical. And it works. When students walk out of the real test, they often tell me something like, oh, I saw an Australia bird, or I saw Melissa's balloon twice. And this is literally the best thing a student could say. It means they're not just finding the questions easy. Instead, what they're really saying is that they truly recognize the underlying principle of a question. And that is the main goal of test prep, pattern recognition. It's all about looking at a question and being able to say, they're showing me the A, time to do the B. Again, you will never see any of these questions ever again, but you will see that brand of question again on every single test. So let's talk about how you can start to practice this. As you start to take practice sections, start to look for what brands of questions you're missing from test to test. Then, in a notebook, keep a full blank page for each of those topics. And then, on that page, keep a running list of any cousin questions where you missed that topic. So, for example, maybe you keep missing a grammar question that's testing it versus they. So you might have a page that looks something like this. At the top, you would write pronouns, and then under that, you would write Test 3, Section 2, Question 27, or Test 5, Section 2, Question 13. Same thing with the math. Maybe you keep missing systems of equations and solving for a variable with elimination or substitution. So you'd have a page that looks like this. At the top, you would label it Systems of Equations, and then take a note, Test 2, Section 3, Question 12, or Test 1, Section 4, Question 9, wherever you miss it. And as you keep working through practice tests, you'll keep adding questions to these lists. And now the real magic starts, working on your cousin questions in tandem with full-length practice tests. A few years ago, I was playing relief pitcher for a student who had already worked with another tutor. The parents didn't understand why her practice ACT scores were so much higher than her real scores. I asked if she had been taking full-length practice tests under timed conditions. They told me, no. At the risk of stating the obvious, shame on that previous tutor. This is especially egregious for the ACT, where the timing is so much more challenging. You want to be practicing under authentic testing conditions. Which brings us to the next step, taking full-timed practice tests. This now incorporates the stamina and the focus aspect. It's like training for a marathon. You need to go for long runs, not short sprints. Now, when you take your practice tests, try to mimic the real testing conditions as much as possible. As part of that, be strict with the timing. If you're out of time on a section, you must move to the next section. Also, turn off your phone, computer, and all other distractions. Also, to mimic real testing conditions, use your bubble sheet to transfer over your answers. Another important point is to sit for tests only on a weekend. Otherwise, it's diminishing returns with energy. You shouldn't take a full test after school. And above all, keep adding to your list of cousin questions. Which brings us to the next step, working on your cousin questions between the practice tests. Now, I understand that taking practice tests monopolizes a lot of your time. So, find a balance between your schoolwork, practice tests, and of course, some downtime. Plan your schoolwork accordingly and carve out at least a few windows for practice tests in the weeks leading into the real thing. But you can lighten the load when you need to. So, when you're in a stretch of heavier schoolwork, you can go a little easier on yourself. So during a heavier week of school, maybe just work on your rules, formulas, and studying your flashcards. Also, you can just take independent sections instead of full tests. And above all, work on your cousin questions. This way, you can practice a given topic on consecutive questions. So you might struggle to spot a certain rule if you see it mixed in with a bunch of other questions. But if you drill it with 3 consecutive cousin questions, you really start to pattern it in your brain. For example, maybe you have a hard time with subject-verb agreement because you can't always spot a prepositional phrase. But when you do it 3 times in a row, you start to catch it. And this is where the cousin questions really work their magic. By working on cousin questions consecutively, you train your brain how all of these questions are the same. So, stay diligent and keep working on your cousin questions between your practice tests. And as you do, feel free to get creative as you name each brand of question that you see. You've already seen some of my silly mnemonic devices, like Melissa's balloon and Australia's bird. And I've hit many others in the previous videos as well, like healthy Greek salad for coordinate adjectives, or widgets for algebraic thinking. My students know these stupid little phrases very well. And you can do the same thing. You can name a certain topic after your Uncle Artie or one of your favorite types of foods. Who cares? Whatever helps you recognize the underlying mechanism of the question. It's all about pattern recognition. They're showing me A, time to do the B. Which brings us into the week of the test. Check out video 14 for my full checklist of what to do for the days leading into the exam. But briefly, take your final practice test on the Saturday before. From there, use the week to look at any remaining rules or cousin questions that still give you trouble. And wake up at the same time that you will for the test each day. This might not affect if you're taking the test during the school year because you're getting up at that time anyway, but just in case you're taking the test during recess or summer break. The night before the test, do a final review of any rules, formulas, notes, and flashcards. You're allowed to miss a question because of difficulty, timing, or careless error. Make sure that you don't miss a question just because you haven't memorized a certain rule, formula, or definition yet. After that, put aside all your test-taking materials, so your ID, admissions ticket, pencils, snacks and water, calculator, mask. Just have everything ready to go so you don't have to think about it the next morning. And from there, relax and get a good night's rest. Don't stay up till 2 in the morning doing practice sections or studying. I'd rather you be well rested for the morning of the test. So ease off the gas and get some sleep. Now, the morning of the test, you want to wake up your brain as well as your body. This way you can go in as energized as possible. Treat the test like an athletic event. So, the morning of the test, eat a good breakfast. And over breakfast, read something. This warms up your brain. And then from there, get in 10 to 15 minutes of light cardio exercise. This warms up your body as well. And in the test room, keep your energy up, avoid all careless errors, and do the best you can. Again, check out video 14 for a more detailed list of what to do during the exam itself. And if nothing else, please never leave a question blank. So, 30 seconds left, B, 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 or whatever letter you want. Now, hopefully, you hit your target scores sooner than later. But if you need to take the test again, take advantage of those months where you get to analyze the questions. Just to recap from before, for the SAT, this is offered for October, March, and May, and the ACT, December, April, and June. And the good news is that these questions usually come out before the next round. I'll give College Board an extra point for this because you don't have to wait for the booklet to arrive in the mail. The questions appear online about 2 weeks after you take the test. So you can analyze your October results fairly quickly before you take the November exam. Likewise, with the March results coming out well before the May exam, and the May results coming out just before the June exam. For the ACT, you have to wait for the hard copy of the test booklet to arrive in the mail. But the December booklet typically arrives a few weeks before the February exam, and likewise with the April booklet arriving just before the June test. The June exam gets a little tighter in terms of arriving before the July exam. The short answer, it depends. Now, once your questions appear online or in the mail, be sure to add any that you missed to your list of cousin questions. This is extremely valuable because you can now analyze exactly what you're missing from the actual test room. Many of those questions should be cousins of topics you've already seen. Or, if it's a totally new topic, add another page for that rule. This can definitely happen for those last 20 ACT math questions. Remember, they don't just throw in those harder topics, they throw in more random topics that never appeared on the test before. I know, I don't like it either. So start any new page as needed to hit those newer rules. The final piece of the puzzle is knowing when to retire. On the one hand, I don't want to deprive any student of another chance to improve his or her score. On the other hand, there comes a point of diminishing returns where the numbers will plateau. Endless effort does not yield endless rewards on a standardized test. I cover this in much more detail in video 6. Check it out. But the main takeaway is this. You want to think about how your practice scores compare to your real scores from the actual test. This is why it's so important to take full-length practice tests. The primary goal of practice tests is, of course, to practice the material. But in addition to that, you also want to get a sense of your score range. This way, you could see where your numbers fall on a good day versus a bad day. So after you take the test, think about how your real scores compare to your practice numbers. If you are right in the middle of your typical practice range, it could be a judgment call. If you're well below that range, it could be an easy decision to take the test again. And if you score in the upper range of your practice numbers, or certainly if you score well above that, then you could think about retiring. Just make sure to have reasonable expectations. At a certain point, the numbers will plateau. I'll say again, endless effort does not yield endless rewards on a standardized test. So, be honest with yourself if you feel like you have another shot in you. If you feel like you've done your best, or if you're just exhausted by the process of taking the test for several rounds, it might be time to hang up your number 2 pencil. But if you feel energized and focused, then go for it. This can be a hard decision to make. Feel free to leave any questions in the comment section below. It will help others who are going through the same process. I'll do my best to answer any questions that you have. Whew! We made it! I know this video was a little longer, but the test season has many moving parts. So if you found any part of this video helpful, be sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Again, wishing you all a very happy and healthy holiday season. And as we move into 2021, use this video and the others to help you plan your work and work your plan. See you next time.